A Kingdom at Peace.
France, 1918.
Isabel Hartley walked the battlefield alone, her boots crunching in the fresh snow. Then she stopped. Ahead of her, a second trail of footprints appeared leading toward her. But there was no one there. And at the end of the path, written in the snow, was a single name. Samuel Hayes. Chapter 1. The Ghost of Samuel Hayes. The biting wind whipped at Isabel Hartley's woolen scarf, stinging her cheeks a furious red. France, January 1918. The war, everyone said, was nearing its end, but the landscape, a canvas of frozen mud and shattered trees, told a different story. One of endless, brutal endurance. Isabel walked the battlefield alone, a habit born not of courage, but of a desperate need to breathe air untainted by the cloying scent of antiseptic and despair that permeated the field hospital. Her boots crunched in the fresh snow, a stark, lonely sound in the vast, white silence. She had volunteered as a nurse 2 years prior, fueled by a naive patriotism and a yearning to escape the suffocating confines of her life in London. Her fiancé, Edward, had enlisted immediately, his letters filled with a romanticized heroism that had quickly faded, replaced by a grim, terse silence. He'd been killed at Passchendaele, a single line in a telegram shattering the carefully constructed future she had envisioned. The grief had been a physical blow, a weight that settled in her chest, making each breath a conscious effort. Now, she found solace only in these solitary walks, tracing the ghostly outlines of battles fought and lives lost. The snow, at least, offered a temporary shroud, a pristine blanket over the horrors beneath. Today, however, the illusion was broken. Isabel stopped. Ahead of her, a second trail of footprints appeared leading toward her. They were fresh, the edges crisp in the newly fallen snow, distinctly different from her own well-worn path. But there was no one there. The vast, empty expanse stretched before her, unbroken except for the skeletal remains of a bombed-out farmhouse in the distance. A shiver, colder than the January wind, traced its way down her spine. She took a tentative step forward, her heart hammering against her ribs. Perhaps a soldier, lost or disoriented. But the footprints, they ended abruptly, just a few feet from where she stood, as if the person who made them had simply vanished into thin air. And then she saw it. Written in the snow, at the end of the mysterious path, was a single name. Samuel Hayes. The name was unfamiliar, a whisper from the ether. It held no resonance, no connection to anyone she knew, living or dead. Yet it felt significant, imbued with a weight that belied its simple inscription in the ephemeral snow. Isabel knelt, her gloved fingers tracing the letters. The snow was already beginning to melt, the name blurring at the edges, threatening to disappear as quickly as it had appeared. She felt a sudden, inexplicable urge to preserve it, to understand its meaning. Why this name? Why here?
Why now?
She pulled a small, worn notebook and a stub of pencil from her pocket tools she used to record messages for patients, last words, desperate pleas to loved ones. She carefully copied the name, the pencil scratching against the paper, a sound that seemed strangely loud in the oppressive silence. As she stood, a distant rumble echoed across the fields. Artillery fire. It was a constant presence, a backdrop to their lives, but today it felt closer, more ominous. A warning. Isabel glanced back at the footprints, already fading, melting back into the anonymity of the snow. A sense of unease, a prickling premonition, settled over her. She had stumbled upon something she couldn't yet comprehend. Something that felt both dangerous and profoundly important. The wind picked up, swirling the snow around her, obscuring the path she had taken. She felt a sudden, irrational fear, a sense of being watched, of being followed. She turned, scanning the desolate landscape, but saw nothing. Only the endless white, the skeletal trees, and the distant, mournful rumble of the guns. She began to walk back towards the field hospital, her pace quickening. The image of the name, Samuel Hayes, burned in her mind. It was a puzzle, a mystery, a ghost in the snow. And she knew, with a certainty that defied logic, that it was a mystery she had to solve. It was a connection, however tenuous, to something beyond the endless cycle of suffering and death that had become her world. A thread of hope, perhaps, in the unraveling tapestry of war. Or something far more sinister. The uncertainty was almost unbearable. The snow fell heavier now. Chapter 2. Whispers in the Ruins of Reims. The field hospital, housed in a partially destroyed convent on the outskirts of Reims, was a cacophony of groans, whispered prayers, and the clatter of medical instruments. The air hung heavy with the smells of blood, disinfectant, and unwashed bodies. Isabel, back in her starched white uniform, moved through the chaos with a practiced efficiency, her earlier unease a dull throb beneath the surface of her immediate concerns. She checked on a young soldier, barely more than a boy, whose leg had been shattered by shrapnel. His eyes, wide with pain and fear, followed her every move. She offered a reassuring smile, a small act of kindness in a sea of suffering. "You're doing well, Thomas," she said, her voice calm and steady. "Just rest." But rest was a luxury few could afford, even the dying. The constant influx of wounded soldiers, a relentless tide of broken bodies, meant that the nurses were perpetually exhausted, their nerves frayed, their emotions raw. Later, in the relative quiet of the small room she shared with two other nurses, Isabel pulled out her notebook. The name, Samuel Hayes, stared back at her, a stark reminder of the unsettling encounter on the battlefield. She had asked around, discreetly, among the other nurses and the few doctors, but the name drew blank stares. No one had heard of a Samuel Hayes. One of her roommates, a stout, matronly woman named Agnes, noticed the troubled look on Isabel's face. "Something on your mind, dear?" she asked, her voice softened by years of witnessing unimaginable pain. Isabel hesitated, then decided to confide in her. She recounted the strange footprints, the name in the snow. Agnes listened patiently, her expression unreadable. When Isabel finished, Agnes was silent for a moment, her brow furrowed in thought. "Reims is a city of ghosts, Isabel," she said finally, her voice low. "The war has taken so much from us. So many lives lost, so many secrets buried." "But the footprints, they were so clear," Isabel insisted. "And the name, it felt intentional." Agnes sighed. "There are things in this war, Isabel, that defy explanation. Things that are best left undisturbed." Her words, meant to be comforting, only fueled Isabel's unease. She knew Agnes was right, that the war had created a world of shadows and uncertainties, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the name was a clue, a breadcrumb in a trail she was meant to follow. The next day, during a brief lull in the relentless flow of patients, Isabel found herself drawn to the convent's chapel. It was mostly in ruins, the stained glass windows shattered, the altar reduced to rubble. But a small section, near the back, had been spared the worst of the damage. A single candle flickered on a makeshift altar, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. She sat on a broken pew, the cold stones seeping through her uniform. The silence, broken only by the distant rumble of artillery fire, was almost palpable. She closed her eyes, trying to clear her mind, to find some semblance of peace in the ravaged sanctuary. And then she heard it, a whisper, faint, almost imperceptible, but definitely there. It seemed to come from the shadows behind the altar. Isabel held her breath, listening intently. The whisper came again, a single word, barely audible. "Hayes." Her heart leaped into her throat. She stood up, her legs trembling. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice echoing in the empty chapel. Silence. Only the flickering candle and the distant guns. She cautiously approached the altar, her hand reaching out to touch the cold stone. As she did, her fingers brushed against something hidden in the shadows. A small, leather-bound book. She pulled it out, her heart pounding. The book was old, the leather worn and cracked, the pages yellowed with age. She opened it carefully, her fingers tracing the faded inscription on the title page. The Diary of Samuel Hayes. A wave of dizziness washed over her. It was real. He was real. The name in the snow was not a figment of her imagination, not a ghost, but a man. A man who had left behind a record of his life, a story waiting to be discovered. And for reason that felt beyond fate, this testament had found her. She looked around the ruined chapel, a sense of wonder mixed with a growing apprehension. The whispers, the book, it was all connected. She was being drawn into a mystery, a secret hidden within the ruins of Reims. And she knew, with a chilling certainty, that the journey had just begun. The distant artillery fire felt suddenly like a warning, or perhaps a promise. Chapter 3. The Letter from a Dead Man. The diary was fragile, the pages brittle and threatening to crumble at the slightest touch. Isabel carried it back to her room, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. Agnes and her other roommate, a young, timid girl named Clara, were already asleep, their exhausted breaths filling the small, cramped space. Isabel lit a small oil lamp, casting a flickering, golden glow over the room, and carefully opened the book. The first entry was dated 1914, just before the outbreak of the war. Samuel Hayes's handwriting was elegant, flowing, a stark contrast to the hurried scrawls she was used to seeing in soldiers' letters. He wrote of his life in Reims, his love for the city, his hopes for the future. He was a scholar, a historian, fascinated by the rich and turbulent past of the region. As Isabel read, she was drawn into Samuel's world, a world of quiet contemplation and intellectual pursuits, a world that seemed a million miles away from the brutal reality of the war. He wrote of his research, his discoveries, his passion for uncovering the secrets hidden within the ancient stones of Reims. She turned the pages slowly, carefully, absorbing every word. He wrote of his family, his friends, his love for a woman named Elise. His words were filled with a tenderness, a longing, that resonated deeply with Isabel, reminding her of her own lost love, of the future that had been stolen from her.
Then, the tone of the diary changed.
The entries became shorter, more hurried, filled with a growing sense of dread. The war had arrived, shattering the tranquility of Samuel's world. He wrote of the fear, the uncertainty, the growing sense of impending doom. He had volunteered for service, not as a soldier, but as an intelligence officer, using his knowledge of the region, his fluency in French and German, to gather information, to decode messages, to help the war effort in any way he could. Isabel paused, her breath catching in her throat. An intelligence officer.
A spy.
The whispers in the chapel, the hidden diary, it all began to make sense. Samuel Hayes was not just a scholar. He was a man caught in the dangerous undercurrents of the war, a man with secrets to protect. She continued reading, her heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. The entries became more cryptic, filled with coded references, veiled allusions to secret meetings, dangerous missions. He wrote of a network of informants, of hidden messages, of a constant threat of discovery and betrayal. Then she found it, a single entry, dated just a few months before her arrival in Reims, that made her blood run cold.
They know.
They suspect me. I fear I have been compromised. I must hide the truth, protect Elise. If anything happens to me, I pray this diary will find its way to someone who can. The entry ended abruptly, unfinished. The next page was blank.
And the next.
The rest of the diary was empty. Isabel closed the book, her hands trembling. Samuel Hayes had been silenced. His story unfinished. His secrets buried. But by whom?
And why?
She looked around the small room, the sleeping forms of Agnes and Clara a stark contrast to the turmoil raging within her. She was holding a dead man's secrets, a dangerous legacy that could put her own life at risk. Suddenly, a scrap of paper fell from the diary, a small, folded note that had been tucked between the pages. Isabel picked it up, her fingers fumbling with the delicate paper. She unfolded it carefully, revealing a single sentence, written in the same elegant handwriting as the diary. Find the rose window. It holds the key. The rose window. Isabel knew immediately what it referred to. The magnificent rose window of the Reims Cathedral, a masterpiece of Gothic architecture, had been partially destroyed in the early days of the war. But a large section of it remained, a testament to the enduring beauty of the city, even in the face of destruction. But what key did it hold? And what was it the key to? Isabel felt a surge of adrenaline, a renewed sense of purpose. Samuel Hayes's story was not over. His message, delivered from beyond the grave, had given her a mission. She had to find the rose window, uncover its secrets, and bring his story to light. She knew it was dangerous, that she was stepping into a world of espionage and betrayal, a world where the lines between friend and foe were blurred. But she couldn't ignore the call. She owed it to Samuel, to Elise, to herself. She carefully folded the note and tucked it into her pocket, along with the diary. The oil lamp flickered, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. She looked at the sleeping forms of her roommates, their peaceful slumber a stark contrast to the dangerous path she was about to embark on. As she blew out the lamp, plunging the room into darkness, she knew that her life had changed forever. She was no longer just a nurse, tending to the wounded and the dying. She was a guardian of secrets, a seeker of truth, a woman walking in the footsteps of a ghost. She felt more alive, strangely, than she had in years. The darkness, this time, felt promising, not threatening. Chapter 4. A shadow across the ward. The following days were a blur of activity. The hospital was overflowing with casualties from a renewed offensive, the relentless tide of wounded soldiers pushing Isabel and the other nurses to their breaking point. But amidst the chaos, Samuel Hayes's diary and the cryptic message about the rose window were never far from her thoughts. She found moments, stolen between tending to patients and grabbing snatches of sleep, to study the diary, searching for any further clues, any hint of what Samuel had been involved in, what secrets he had been protecting. She learned more about Elise, the woman he loved. She was a musician, a pianist, with a spirit as fiery and vibrant as her music. Samuel's descriptions of her were filled with a poignant longing, a love that transcended the horrors of the war. Isabel found herself drawn to Elise, feeling a kinship with this woman she had never met, a woman who had also loved and lost in the midst of the conflict. She wondered what had become of her, whether she was still alive, still waiting for a man who would never return. One evening, as Isabel was changing the dressing on a soldier's badly burned arm, she noticed a figure lurking in the shadows at the edge of the ward. It was a man, tall and thin, wearing a dark coat and a hat pulled low over his face. He was watching her, his gaze intense and unsettling. Isabel felt a prickle of unease. She had seen him before, she was sure of it, hovering around the hospital, always in the periphery, always watching. She had dismissed it at first, attributing it to the general paranoia that permeated the war-torn city. But now, with Samuel's diary and the knowledge of his secret life, she couldn't shake the feeling that this man was connected to the mystery. She tried to catch his eye, to confront him, but he melted back into the shadows and disappeared. Isabel's heart pounded in her chest. She was being watched. She was not alone in her quest. Someone else knew about Samuel Hayes, about his secrets, and they were watching her every move. The next day, during a rare moment of respite, Isabel decided to visit the Reims Cathedral. She needed to see the rose window, to follow Samuel's instructions, to find the key he had spoken of. She walked through the war-ravaged streets of Reims, the city a stark reminder of the destructive power of the conflict. Buildings were reduced to rubble, streets were cratered with shell holes, and the air was thick with the smell of smoke and decay. The cathedral, despite its damaged state, still stood tall, a symbol of resilience and hope amidst the devastation. Isabel entered the vast, echoing space, her footsteps reverberating on the stone floor. The air was cold and damp, and the silence was almost deafening, broken only by the occasional drip of water from the damaged roof. She made her way to the rose window, her heart pounding with anticipation. A large section of it had been destroyed, the intricate stained glass shattered into a million pieces. But a significant portion remained, the vibrant colors of the glass still glowing with an ethereal beauty, even in the dim light. Isabel stood before the window, her gaze tracing the intricate patterns of the glass, searching for any sign, any clue, anything that might reveal the key Samuel had spoken of. She studied the figures depicted in the window, the saints, the angels, the biblical scenes. She looked for any hidden symbols, any anomalies, any hint of a secret message. Hours passed, and the light began to fade, casting long, colorful shadows across the cathedral floor. Isabel was about to give up, her hope dwindling, when she noticed something. A small section of the window, near the bottom, that was different from the rest. The glass was a different color, a deeper shade of red, and the pattern was slightly different, almost imperceptible, but definitely there. She reached out and touched the glass, her fingers tracing the outline of a small, almost hidden rose. It was a symbol, a secret mark, something that had been deliberately placed there, hidden in plain sight. As she touched the rose, she felt a slight click. A small section of the stone frame around the window shifted, revealing a hidden compartment. Isabel's heart leaped into her throat. She had found it. The key. Carefully, she reached into the compartment and pulled out a small, metal box. It was locked, but the key, she knew, must be somewhere. The answer was likely in the diary. Back to Samuel. The box was surprisingly heavy. She looked around the cathedral, a sense of unease creeping over her. She was not alone. She could feel it. The shadows seemed to be closing in, the silence pressing down on her. She quickly hid the box under her coat and hurried out of the cathedral, her footsteps echoing in the gathering dusk. She had to get back to the hospital, to safety, to examine the box and find the key. But as she walked, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being followed, that the shadow from the ward was still out there, watching her, waiting for the right moment to strike. She clutched the hidden box. The hunt was on. Chapter 5. The Spy Among the Sisters. Back at the hospital, the usual evening chaos reigned. Isabel, clutching the metal box concealed beneath her cloak, navigated the crowded wards, the cries of the wounded a constant, throbbing backdrop. She needed privacy, a safe place to examine the box and search for the key. Her shared room was out of the question. She decided to seek refuge in the small, rarely used library, a room filled with dusty books and forgotten medical journals. It was a quiet, secluded space, perfect for her clandestine task. Once inside, she locked the door and lit a single oil lamp, the flickering light casting long, dancing shadows on the shelves. She placed the metal box on a small table and examined it closely. It was plain, unadorned, made of a dark, heavy metal. There were no markings, no inscriptions, nothing to indicate its contents. She tried to open it, but it was firmly locked. She needed a key, a small, intricate key, she imagined, that would fit the delicate lock. She thought of Samuel's diary, of his meticulous nature, his love of puzzles and secrets. The key must be hidden somewhere, somewhere connected to him, to Elise, to his life before the war. She pulled out the diary and began to reread it, searching for any mention of a key, a box, a hiding place. She scanned the pages, her fingers tracing the familiar handwriting, her mind racing. Suddenly, a noise outside the door startled her. A soft tapping, a hesitant knock. Isabel froze, her heart pounding in her chest. Who could it be? Isabel? Are you in there? It was Agnes's voice. Isabel hesitated, her mind racing. Could she trust her? Agnes had been kind, supportive, a mother figure in the midst of the chaos. But she had also warned her to leave the past undisturbed. Isabel? It's Agnes. I need to talk to you. Isabel took a deep breath and unlocked the door. Agnes stood in the hallway, her expression concerned. Is everything all right, dear? You've been acting strangely lately. Isabel forced a smile. I'm fine, Agnes. Just doing a little reading. Agnes glanced at the oil lamp, the closed door. At this hour? In the library? Isabel's mind raced. She couldn't tell Agnes the truth, not yet. She needed to protect Samuel's secrets, to protect herself. I couldn't sleep, she said, her voice trembling slightly. The noise in the ward was too much. Agnes studied her for a moment, her eyes filled with a mixture of concern and suspicion.
You know you can talk to me, Isabel.
We're all under a lot of strain here. We need to look out for each other. Isabel nodded, her throat tight with emotion. She wanted to confide in Agnes, to share the burden of her secret, but she couldn't. Not yet. I know, Agnes, she said. Thank you.
I'll be fine.
Agnes hesitated, then nodded. All right, dear. But if you need anything, you know where to find me. She turned and walked away, her footsteps echoing in the silent hallway. Isabel closed the door and locked it again, her heart still pounding. She was alone again, with the metal box and the mystery it contained. She returned to the diary, her determination renewed. She had to find the key. She had to unlock the secrets of Samuel Hayes. As she continued reading, she noticed something she had missed before. A small, almost imperceptible indentation on the inside cover of the diary, near the spine. She ran her fingers over it, feeling a slight bump beneath the leather. Carefully, she used a small scalpel from her medical kit to pry open the leather, revealing a hidden compartment. And there it was. A small, silver key, intricately carved with the image of a rose. Isabel's breath caught in her throat. The rose window. The key. It was all connected. She took the key and placed it in the lock of the metal box. It fit perfectly. She turned the key, and the lock clicked open. Slowly, she lifted the lid of the box, her heart pounding with anticipation. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, were several items. A photograph of a beautiful woman with dark hair and piercing eyes, Elise. A stack of letters, tied together with a faded ribbon. And a small, leather-bound notebook, smaller than Samuel's diary. Isabel picked up the notebook, her fingers trembling. She opened it and began to read. It was Elise's diary. As she read, a new layer of the mystery began to unfold. Elise was not just a musician, she was also involved in the resistance, working with Samuel to gather information, to help the Allied cause. She wrote of their secret meetings, their coded messages, their shared danger, and their shared love. The entry stopped abruptly, not long after Samuel's last. Isabel felt a chill run down her spine. She was holding the secrets of two lovers, two spies, caught in the web of war. And she was now a part of their story, a link in the chain of their dangerous legacy. The diary ended with this: I fear for Samuel. He grows distant. I will take matters into my own hands if I must. I will not falter. Chapter 6. Rendezvous at Midnight. Elise's diary was a whirlwind of coded messages, clandestine meetings, and narrow escapes. Isabel pored over the entries, deciphering the veiled language, piecing together the fragments of their dangerous lives. She discovered that Elise and Samuel were part of a larger network of spies, operating throughout occupied France, gathering intelligence and relaying it to the Allied forces. One name appeared repeatedly in Elise's diary: Le Corbeau the Raven. He was their contact, the mysterious figure who received their information and passed it on to higher authorities. But Elise's entries also hinted at a growing distrust of Le Corbeau. She suspected he was playing a double game, that he might be betraying them to the Germans. Isabel felt a growing sense of urgency. She had to find out what happened to Elise and Samuel, what role Le Corbeau had played in their fate. And she had to do it quickly, before the shadow that had been following her caught up with her. In one of the last entries in Elise's diary, she found a reference to a planned rendezvous with Le Corbeau. It was to take place at midnight, at a deserted café on the outskirts of Reims, Le Chat Noir the Black Cat. The date was left blank, but Isabel had a gut feeling that it was significant, that it was connected to Samuel's disappearance. She decided to go to the café. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but she had to follow every lead, every thread of the mystery. She knew it was dangerous, that she was walking into a potential trap, but she couldn't turn back. That night, as the hospital quieted down, Isabel slipped out unnoticed. She dressed in dark clothing, pulling a scarf over her head to conceal her face. She made her way through the darkened streets of Reims, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and anticipation. The cafe, Le Chat Noir, was a dilapidated building, its windows boarded up, its sign barely visible in the dim moonlight. It looked abandoned, deserted, a ghost of its former self. Isabel approached cautiously, her senses on high alert. She circled the building, looking for any sign of life, any indication that she was in the right place. She found a back door, slightly ajar, and slipped inside. The interior of the cafe was dark and dusty, the air thick with a smell of stale wine and decay. Tables and chairs were overturned, covered in a thick layer of dust. Moonlight filtered through cracks in the boarded-up windows, casting eerie shadows on the walls. Isabel moved slowly, silently, through the deserted cafe, her hand reaching for the small scalpel she carried in her pocket. She felt a presence, a sense of being watched, but she saw no one. Suddenly, she heard a noise. A soft creak, a rustle of movement, coming from the back room. She held her breath, listening intently. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice trembling slightly. Silence. Only the beating of her own heart. She cautiously approached the back room, her scalpel held tightly in her hand. She pushed open the door and stepped inside. The room was small and bare, with a single window overlooking a deserted alleyway. A figure stood silhouetted against the moonlight, their back to her.
Le corbeau?
Isabel asked, her voice barely a whisper. The figure turned slowly. It was a woman, tall and slender, with dark hair pulled back in a tight bun. Her face was pale and drawn, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and determination. "Elise?" Isabel gasped, her heart leaping into her throat. The woman nodded slowly. "You have the diary?" she asked, her voice hoarse. Isabel was stunned. Elise was alive. After all this time, after believing her to be dead, she was standing before her, a ghost from the past. "Yes," Isabel said, her voice trembling. "I have it. And Samuel's diary, too." Elise's eyes widened. "Samuel's? You found it?" "Yes," Isabel said. "I know about everything. About Le Corbeau. About the network." Elise took a step closer, her gaze intense. "Then you know the danger we're in." "Yes," Isabel said. "And I want to help." A faint smile flickered across Elise's lips. "You are brave, mademoiselle."
Hartley, Isabel said.
Isabel Hartley. "Isabel," Elise said, "you have stumbled upon a dangerous secret. A secret that many have died to protect."
She paused.
"And a secret that I intend to expose, no matter the cost." The moonlight seemed to catch the glint of steel in her hand. A small but deadly pistol. Chapter 7. The Price of a Promise. The revelation that Elise was alive and armed sent a jolt of adrenaline through Isabel. The air in the small, dusty room crackled with tension. "Le Corbeau betrayed us," Elise said, her voice low and filled with a simmering rage. "He sold us out to the Germans. Samuel was captured. I barely escaped." Isabel's mind raced, trying to process this new information. "But the diary Samuel wrote that he feared he had been compromised. He wanted to protect you." Elise nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears.
"He did.
He sacrificed himself to save me. He knew Le Corbeau was a traitor. He left the diary, the clues, hoping someone would find them, would expose the truth. But why didn't you come forward?" Isabel asked. "Why stay hidden?" Elise's expression hardened. "Because Le Corbeau is still out there. He's powerful, influential. He has connections on both sides of the war. I had to disappear, to bide my time, to gather evidence. I had to find someone I could trust." "And you think that's me?" Isabel asked, a mixture of disbelief and apprehension in her voice. Elise studied her for a moment, her gaze piercing. "You found the diaries. You came here. You risked your life. That tells me something." She paused. "And Samuel, he had good instincts. I trust his judgment, even from beyond the grave." Isabel felt a surge of emotion, a sense of responsibility, of being drawn into something far larger than herself. She had stumbled upon a conspiracy, a betrayal that had cost Samuel his life and forced Elise into hiding. "What do you want me to do?" Isabel asked, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. Elise took a deep breath. I need your help to expose Le Corbeau, to bring him to justice, to avenge Samuel's death.
But how?
Isabel asked.
He's powerful, you said.
He has connections. Elise smiled, a cold, determined smile. I have a plan, but it's dangerous. It will require courage, cunning, and a willingness to risk everything. Isabel thought of the wounded soldiers in the hospital, of the endless suffering she had witnessed. She thought of Edward, her lost love, of the senselessness of the war. She thought of Samuel, of his sacrifice, of his trust in her. I'm ready, Isabel said, her voice firm. Tell me what to do. Elise outlined her plan. It was audacious, intricate, and incredibly risky. It involved infiltrating a high-level meeting of German officers, where Le Corbeau was expected to be present. Elise had obtained information about the meeting, a secret gathering at a chateau outside of Reims. Isabel's role would be to pose as a nurse, attending to a wounded German officer who was invited to the meeting. She would use her access to gather evidence, to identify Le Corbeau, and to expose his treachery. It's our only chance, Elise said. We have to strike now, before he can do any more damage. Isabel knew the risks. If she were caught, she would be executed as a spy. But she also knew that she couldn't stand idly by, that she had a duty to honor Samuel's memory, to help Elise bring his killer to justice. She thought about her promise, made internally, to keep the secret. I'll do it, Isabel said, her heart pounding in her chest. For Samuel, for you, for all those who have suffered because of his betrayal. Elise nodded, a glimmer of hope in her eyes. We'll work together, she said. We'll need to prepare, to gather supplies, to forge documents. We have very little time. As they began to discuss the details of the plan, a sudden noise from outside the cafe startled them. Footsteps, heavy and approaching fast. Someone's coming, Elise whispered, her hand reaching for her pistol. We have to go.
Now.
They slipped out of the back door and into the deserted alleyway, melting into the shadows just as a group of German soldiers rounded the corner. Isabel and Elise ran, their hearts pounding, their breath coming in ragged gasps. They had to escape, to disappear, to prepare for the dangerous mission that lay ahead. The price of their promise, they both knew, could very well be their lives. But some things were worth dying for. Chapter 8. Echoes of the Somme. The next few days were a whirlwind of clandestine preparations. Isabel and Elise met in secret, hidden in the ruins of bombed-out buildings, whispering their plans in the shadows. Elise, a master of disguise and deception, procured forged documents, a nurse's uniform that would allow Isabel to pass as a member of the German Medical Corps, and a detailed map of the chateau where the meeting was to take place. Isabel, meanwhile, used her position at the hospital to gather information, to learn about the wounded German officer, Major Wilhelm Schmidt, who was her ticket into the chateau. She discovered that he was a high-ranking intelligence officer, close to Le Corbeau, and that he had been injured in a recent battle near the Somme. The Somme. The name sent a shiver down Isabel's spine. It was a place of unimaginable horror, a battlefield where countless lives had been lost, a symbol of the futility and brutality of the war. Edward had fought there before being transferred to Passchendaele. She had received letters from him, describing the mud, the blood, the constant shelling, the sheer terror of the trenches. As Isabel prepared for her mission, she found herself haunted by echoes of the Somme, by the ghosts of the soldiers who had died there, by the memory of Edward's letters. She felt a renewed sense of determination, a burning desire to fight for justice, to make their sacrifices mean something. One evening, as Isabel and Elise were reviewing their plans, Elise noticed the troubled look on Isabel's face. You're thinking of him, aren't you? Elise asked softly. You're Edward. Isabel nodded, her throat tight with emotion.
He wrote to me about the Somme, about the horrors he witnessed.
I can't help but think of him, of all the others who died there. Elise placed a comforting hand on Isabel's arm. I know, she said. I understand. Samuel, he felt the same way. He hated the war, the senseless killing. He wanted to make a difference, to stop the bloodshed.
And he did, Isabel said.
He sacrificed himself to save you, to expose Le Corbeau. Elise nodded, her eyes filled with tears. We have to finish what he started, Isabel. We have to honor his memory, to make sure his sacrifice was not in vain. Isabel took a deep breath, steeling herself for the task ahead.
We will, she said.
We'll expose Le Corbeau, no matter the cost. The day of the meeting arrived, a cold, gray day that mirrored the somber mood in Isabel's heart. She dressed in the German nurse's uniform, the unfamiliar fabric feeling strange against her skin. She looked at herself in the mirror, barely recognizing the woman staring back at her. She was no longer just Isabel Hartley, the English nurse. She was a spy, an infiltrator, a woman on a dangerous mission. Elise gave her a final briefing, reminding her of the key details, the code words, the escape plan. Be careful, Isabel, she said, her voice filled with concern. Le Corbeau is ruthless. He won't hesitate to kill you if he suspects anything.
I know, Isabel said,
but I'm not afraid. I'm ready. Elise embraced her, a brief, tight hug.
For Samuel, she whispered.
For Samuel, Isabel echoed. She left the hidden meeting place and made her way to the hospital, where a German ambulance was waiting to transport Major Schmidt to the chateau. She climbed into the back of the ambulance, her heart pounding in her chest. The engine started, and the vehicle lurched forward, carrying her towards her destiny. The echoes of the Somme, the memory of Edward, the image of Samuel's face, all fueled her determination. She was ready to face the danger, to confront the enemy, to fight for justice and for the memory of all that the war had taken and all that it threatened to take still. This was more than just a mission, she now realized. Chapter 9. Between Two Fires. The chateau was a grand, imposing structure, nestled in the rolling hills outside of Reims. It had been requisitioned by the German army as a headquarters, its opulent interiors now serving as a backdrop for war planning and clandestine meetings. Isabel, playing the role of a German nurse, felt a knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach as the ambulance pulled up to the heavily guarded entrance. Major Schmidt, pale and weak from his injuries, grunted in pain as the ambulance jolted to a stop. Isabel, maintaining her composure, assisted him out of the vehicle, her eyes scanning the surroundings, taking in the details. Soldiers, armed and alert, patrolled the grounds, their faces grim and unyielding. She was ushered inside, the heavy oak doors closing behind her with a resounding thud, sealing her fate. The interior of the chateau was a stark contrast to the war-torn landscape outside. Crystal chandeliers glittered from the high ceilings, illuminating lavishly decorated rooms filled with antique furniture and priceless artwork. The air was thick with the scent of cigar smoke and expensive perfume, a world away from the stench of the trenches and the field hospital. Isabel accompanied Major Schmidt to his assigned room, a spacious suite overlooking the gardens. She helped him settle into bed, attending to his needs with a practiced efficiency, her mind racing, calculating her next move. She had to find Le Corbeau. She had to gather evidence of his treachery. And she had to do it without arousing suspicion. As the evening wore on, Isabel mingled with the other guests, a mix of high-ranking German officers and their elegantly dressed companions. She listened to their conversations, observing their interactions, searching for any sign of the elusive Le Corbeau. She soon realized that the meeting was not just a social gathering, but a strategic planning session. Maps were spread out on tables, documents were exchanged, and discussions were held in hushed tones. Isabel, posing as a dutiful nurse, used her proximity to Major Schmidt to eavesdrop on conversations, to glean snippets of information. She identified several potential candidates for Le Corbeau. There was General von Kessel, a stern, imposing figure with a reputation for ruthlessness. There was Colonel Steiner, a smooth-talking intelligence officer with a network of contacts throughout occupied France. And there was Herr Müller, a civilian advisor, a shadowy figure who seemed to be pulling the strings from behind the scenes. Isabel felt like she was walking a tightrope, balanced precariously between two fires. One wrong move, one misplaced word, could expose her and lead to her capture, or worse. As the night wore on, Isabel managed to get close to Mueller. He was a small, unassuming man with a sharp, intelligent gaze. He seemed to be at the center of the discussions, his voice carrying a quiet authority that commanded respect. Isabel, pretending to adjust Major Schmidt's bandages, subtly positioned herself near Mueller, listening intently to his conversation with General von Kessel. "The information is reliable," Mueller was saying, his voice low and confidential. "Our contact in Reims assures us that the Allies are planning a major offensive." "And the timing?" von Kessel asked, his voice gruff. "Within the week," Mueller replied. "We must act quickly to counter their plans." Isabel's heart pounded in her chest. She had heard enough.
Müller was Le Corbeau.
He was the traitor, the man who had betrayed Samuel and Elise. She needed to get out, to warn Elise, to expose Mueller's treachery. But she couldn't simply leave. She had to find concrete evidence, something that would prove his guilt beyond a doubt. As she was pondering her next move, she noticed a small, leather-bound notebook on a table near Mueller. It looked familiar, strikingly similar to Samuel's diary. Isabel knew she had to get her hands on that notebook. It could contain the evidence she needed, the proof that would bring Le Corbeau down. But how? She was trapped, surrounded by enemies, walking a razor's edge between success and disaster. And the clock, she knew, was ticking. She felt the weight of responsibility and felt for the forged papers in her pocket. It was now or never. Chapter 10. The Secret of the Locket. The notebook lay tantalizingly close, yet impossibly far. Isabel knew that grabbing it outright was too risky. She needed a distraction, a way to divert attention away from herself and Mueller. She glanced around the room, her mind racing. The officers were engrossed in their discussions, their voices rising and falling in a cacophony of strategic planning. Major Schmidt, her supposed patient, was dozing fitfully in a nearby armchair, his medication finally taking effect. An idea sparked in Isabel's mind. A risky gambit, but it was her only chance. She approached Major Schmidt, pretending to check his pulse. She accidentally bumped his arm, causing him to stir and cry out in pain. "Oh, I'm so sorry, Major," Isabel said, her voice loud enough to attract attention. "I didn't mean to disturb you." The officers turned their heads, their conversations momentarily interrupted. Isabel, feigning concern, fussed over Major Schmidt, apologizing profusely. "It's all right, nurse," Schmidt mumbled, his voice slurred with medication. "Just a bit clumsy, that's all." Isabel continued to make a show of attending to Schmidt, creating a minor commotion that drew the attention of those nearby. Meanwhile, her eyes were fixed on Mueller, who had momentarily turned away from the table where the notebook lay. This was her chance. With a swift, practiced movement, Isabel slipped the notebook from the table and concealed it beneath her cloak. Her heart hammered in her chest, but she maintained her composure, continuing to fuss over Major Schmidt. After a few minutes, the commotion subsided, and the officers returned to their discussions. Isabel, her heart still racing, excused herself, saying she needed to fetch some fresh water for Major Schmidt. She hurried out of the room, clutching the notebook tightly, and made her way to a small, deserted antechamber. She locked the door behind her and leaned against it, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She had the notebook, but she still needed to get out of the chateau, to escape with the evidence. She opened the notebook, her fingers trembling. It was indeed similar to Samuel's diary, filled with coded entries, names, dates, and locations. But there was something else. Tucked between the pages was a small, silver locket, engraved with the initials SH. Isabel's heart skipped a beat. Samuel's locket. She recognized it from the descriptions in his diary, the locket he had given to Elise as a token of his love. She carefully opened the locket. Inside, there were 2 miniature portraits. One was of Elise, her beautiful face smiling up at her. The other was of a man Isabel recognized instantly. It was her Mueller. But he looked younger, less hardened, his eyes filled with a warmth that was absent in his current demeanor. Isabel gasped, her mind reeling. Mueller was not just Le Corbeau, he was Samuel's brother. The realization hit her like a physical blow. The betrayal was even deeper, more personal, than she had imagined. Samuel had been betrayed by his own flesh and blood, by the man he had trusted implicitly. The notebook contained further evidence, details of Mueller's dealings with the Germans, his coded messages, his payments for information. It was all there, the proof she needed to expose his treachery. But the locket was the key to understanding the motive, the reason behind the betrayal. It was a story of sibling rivalry, of jealousy, of a love triangle that had gone horribly wrong. It was all laid out, starkly and heartbreakingly. Isabel closed the locket, her hands trembling. She had the evidence, the proof, the complete story. But she still had to escape, to get the information to Elise. And she knew that Mueller, now aware that she had seen too much, would be hunting her down. He would stop at nothing. The chateau felt less like a refuge and more like a cage. Chapter 11. A dance in the dark. Isabel knew she couldn't simply walk out of the chateau. Mueller would be alerted. The guards would be searching for her. She needed a plan, a way to escape unnoticed. She remembered Elise's instructions, the escape route they had discussed. There was a small, rarely used service entrance at the back of the chateau, leading to a hidden path through the gardens. It was her best chance. She slipped out of the antechamber and made her way through the corridors, avoiding the main rooms where the officers were still gathered. She kept to the shadows, her senses on high alert, listening for any sign of pursuit. As she neared the service entrance, she heard voices, footsteps approaching. She ducked behind a large tapestry, her heart pounding in her chest. It was Mueller and General von Kessel. They were talking in hushed tones, their faces grim. "Find her," Mueller was saying, his voice low and menacing. "She knows too much. She must be silenced." "The nurse?"
Von Kessel asked.
"Are you sure?" "Yes," Mueller replied. "She was snooping around. She took the notebook. She knows." Isabel held her breath, her body pressed against the cold stone wall. They were looking for her. They knew she had the evidence. The two men moved on, their footsteps echoing down the corridor. Isabel waited until she was sure they were gone, then slipped out from behind the tapestry. She reached the service entrance, her hand trembling as she reached for the doorknob. She opened the door slowly, cautiously, and peered outside. The coast was clear. She slipped out into the night, the cold air hitting her face like a slap. She ran, her footsteps crunching on the gravel path, her heart pounding in her chest. She made her way through the gardens, following the hidden path that Elise had described. The moon was hidden behind clouds, casting long, eerie shadows that danced around her. Suddenly, she heard a noise behind her. Footsteps, running fast. She turned and saw a figure emerging from the shadows. It was Mueller. He had found her. "Stop," he shouted, his voice echoing through the night. "You can't escape." Isabel didn't stop. She ran faster, her lungs burning, her legs aching. She could hear Mueller gaining on her. She reached a small, wooden bridge that spanned a narrow stream. She was halfway across when Mueller caught up with her. He grabbed her arm, his grip like a vice. "It's over," he said, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Give me the notebook." Isabel struggled, trying to break free, but he was too strong. She looked into his eyes, seeing not the cold, calculating intelligence officer, but the desperate, haunted face of a man consumed by his own demons. "Why, Samuel?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Why did you betray him?" It was a slip, but she no longer cared. Mueller's eyes widened in surprise. "You know?" he whispered. "Yes," Isabel said. "I know everything. The locket. The diary."
Elise.
A flicker of emotion crossed Mueller's face. Regret? Remorse? It was hard to tell. "It was a mistake," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "A terrible mistake. I loved her too, you see." Before Isabel could respond, a shot rang out, echoing through the night. Mueller gasped, his grip on her arm loosening. He stumbled backward, his eyes wide with shock, and fell over the railing of the bridge, plunging into the dark water below. Isabel stood frozen, her body trembling, her mind reeling. She looked up and saw Elise standing at the edge of the bridge, a smoking pistol in her hand. "Elise," Isabel whispered, her voice hoarse. Elise lowered the pistol, her face pale and drawn. "He would have killed you," she said, her voice trembling. "I had to." The moment was somber and dark. A strange sense of finality, yet incompletion, hung between them. Chapter 12. The Wounded Soldier's Confession. The sound of the gunshot still echoed in Isabel's ears as she and Elise fled the chateau grounds. They ran through the darkness, their breath coming in ragged gasps, the fear of discovery a constant, throbbing presence. They reached the safety of a hidden grove of trees, where they paused to catch their breath. "Are you all right?" Elise asked, her voice filled with concern. Isabel nodded, still shaken by the events of the night. "Yes, I'm fine." "But Mueller Samuel's brother, you killed him." Elise's face was grim. "He gave me no choice. He would have killed us both." He was too far gone, consumed by his own guilt and ambition. Isabel understood. She had seen the darkness in Mueller's eyes, the desperation that had driven him to betray his own brother. But still, the act of taking a life, even in self-defense, weighed heavily on her. They made their way back to Reims, keeping to the shadows, avoiding the main roads. They reached the safe house, a small, nondescript apartment where Elise had been hiding. Once inside, they collapsed onto chairs, exhausted and emotionally drained. Isabel pulled out the notebook and the locket, placing them on the table. "It's all here," she said. "The evidence. The proof of Mueller's treachery." Elise picked up the locket, her fingers tracing the engraved initials. "Samuel," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "He would have wanted this. He wanted the truth to come out." Isabel nodded. "But what now?" she asked. "What do we do with the evidence?" Elise thought for a moment. "We need to get it to the right people," she said. "To someone in the Allied command, someone we can trust." They decided to contact a British intelligence officer, Major Alistair Davies, who was known to be operating in the area. Elise had worked with him before, and she trusted him implicitly. They sent a coded message to Davies, arranging a meeting at a deserted farmhouse outside of Reims. The meeting was set for the following day. That night, Isabel returned to the field hospital, her absence explained away as a late-night emergency call. She was exhausted, but she couldn't sleep. The events of the past few days, the danger, the betrayal, the violence, replayed in her mind. The next morning, as she was tending to her patients, she noticed a new arrival. A young German soldier, badly wounded, his face pale and drawn. He was muttering incoherently, his words a jumble of German and French. Isabel approached him, her medical instincts taking over. She examined his wounds, noting the severity of his injuries. As she was cleaning his wounds, he suddenly grabbed her arm, his grip surprisingly strong. "The notebook," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Mueller, he didn't act alone." Isabel froze, her heart pounding in her chest. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice low and urgent. The soldier's eyes were filled with a desperate plea. There's another," he whispered. "Someone higher up. Someone in the British command." Isabel's blood ran cold. "Another traitor? Someone in the British command? It couldn't be." "Who?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Who is it?" The soldier struggled to speak, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Davies," he whispered. "Major Davies," and then, his eyes closed, his grip on her arm loosening. He was gone. Isabel stood there, stunned, her mind reeling. Major Davies? The man they were supposed to meet, the man they were trusting with the evidence? He was the other traitor? It was a betrayal of an unimaginable scale. She had to warn Elise. But how? Time, she knew, and trust were running out. Chapter 13. Betrayal at Dawn. Isabel's world tilted on its axis. Major Davies, the trusted contact, a traitor? The implications were staggering. She had to warn Elise, but she couldn't simply leave the hospital without arousing suspicion. And she couldn't risk using the usual communication channels, not if Davies was intercepting their messages. She decided to take a calculated risk. She wrote a coded message to Elise, warning her about Davies, and entrusted it to a young orderly, a boy named Pierre, whom she had come to trust. Pierre was a local, with connections to the resistance, and Isabelle knew he could get the message to Elise quickly and discreetly. "This is urgent, Pierre," she said, her voice low and intense. "You must deliver this to the address I've written, and to no one else. Do you understand?" Pierre nodded, his eyes wide with understanding.
"Oui, mademoiselle."
"I understand." He slipped the message into his pocket and disappeared, melting into the bustling activity of the hospital. Isabelle watched him go, her heart filled with a mixture of hope and dread. She spent the rest of the day in a state of agonizing suspense, tending to her patients, her mind racing, constantly replaying the dying soldier's words. Had she done the right thing? Had she trusted the right person? As dawn approached, Isabelle knew she couldn't wait any longer. She had to go to the meeting place to confront Davies, to expose his treachery. She slipped out of the hospital unnoticed, making her way through the deserted streets of Reims. The sky was beginning to lighten, the first rays of dawn painting the horizon with hues of pink and orange. She reached the farmhouse, a dilapidated structure hidden amidst a cluster of trees. The air was still and cold, the silence broken only by the chirping of birds. She approached the farmhouse cautiously, her hand reaching for the small scalpel she carried in her pocket. She pushed open the door and stepped inside. The interior was dark and dusty, the air thick with the smell of decay. She saw a figure standing in the shadows, their back to her. "Elise?" Isabelle called out, her voice trembling slightly. The figure turned slowly. It was not Elise. It was Major Alistair Davies. He smiled, a cold, calculating smile that sent a shiver down Isabelle's spine. "You came," he said, his voice smooth and menacing. "I knew you would." Isabelle's heart sank. She had walked into a trap. "Where is Elise?" she asked, her voice trembling. Davies chuckled. "Oh, she's indisposed at the moment. You see, your little friend Pierre, he's very loyal."
"To me."
Isabelle's blood ran cold. Pierre, the boy she had trusted, had betrayed her. He had delivered the message to Davies, not Elise. "You're the traitor," Isabelle said, her voice filled with a mixture of anger and despair.
"The soldier, he told me."
Davies nodded. A dying man's last words. How poetic. But quite useless, I'm afraid. He took a step closer, his eyes fixed on her. "The notebook, Isabelle. Where is it?" Isabelle knew she was trapped. She had no weapon, no escape. But she wouldn't give up without a fight. She would not let Davies win and let the betrayal continue. "I don't have it," she lied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. Davies smiled. "Don't play games with me, Isabelle. I know you have it. And I know about Samuel. And Elise. And Mueller." He stepped closer. "Give it to me. And perhaps that I'll let you live." Isabelle stood her ground, her eyes locked on his. "Never," she said, her voice filled with defiance. Suddenly, a noise from outside broke the silence. A shout, a struggle, the sound of footsteps running. Davies turned his head, momentarily distracted. Isabelle seized her chance. She lunged forward, driving her scalpel towards his hand. The element of surprise was on her side. Chapter 14.
Escape from Amiens.
The scalpel grazed Davies' hand, drawing a thin line of blood. He roared in pain and surprise, dropping the pistol he had been concealing. Isabelle kicked the pistol away, sending it skidding across the floor. Before Davies could recover, the door burst open, and Elise stormed into the farmhouse, a fierce look in her eyes. She was accompanied by several armed members of the French resistance, their faces grim and determined. "It's over, Davies," Elise said, her voice cold and steady. "You're finished." Davies, realizing he was outnumbered and outgunned, raised his hands in surrender. The resistance fighters quickly disarmed him and bound his hands.
How did you know?"
Davies stammered, his face pale with fear. Elise smiled, a triumphant smile. "Pierre may be loyal to you, but he's not the only one with connections in Reims. I had my suspicions about you, Davies. I set a trap, and you walked right into it. Isabel felt a wave of relief wash over her. Elise had been one step ahead all along. She had anticipated Davy's betrayal and had prepared a countermove. But the message, Isabel said, still confused. Pierre delivered the message, exactly as you instructed, Elise explained. But I had already been warned. A contact in the hospital overheard the German soldier's confession. They got word to me before Pierre did. Isabel was amazed by Elise's resourcefulness and her network of contacts. She had underestimated her, had failed to see the depth of her cunning and determination. With Davies captured, the resistance fighters took him away, promising to deliver him to the Allied authorities. Isabel and Elise were left alone in the farmhouse, the tension of the past few hours finally beginning to dissipate. Thank you, Elise, Isabel said, her voice filled with gratitude. You saved my life. Elise smiled and embraced her. We saved each other, Isabel. We're a team now. They decided to leave Reims, to escape the immediate danger and to find a safer place to regroup. They knew that Davy's capture would send ripples through the German intelligence network, and they didn't want to be caught in the crossfire. They traveled north, towards Amiens, a city that was still under Allied control, but close enough to the front lines to be useful for their future plans. They used back roads, avoiding the main thoroughfares, relying on Elise's contacts in the resistance to provide them with shelter and supplies. The journey was arduous and dangerous, but they were buoyed by their success in exposing Davies and by their growing sense of camaraderie. They were two women, bound together by a shared loss, a shared purpose, and a shared determination to fight for justice. As they approached Amiens, they saw the signs of war all around them. Refugee columns clogged the roads, military vehicles rumbled past, and the distant sound of artillery fire echoed in the air. They found a small, safe house on the outskirts of the city, a place where they could rest and plan their next move. They had the evidence, the notebook, and the locket, and they were determined to use it to expose the remaining traitors, to bring an end to the network of betrayal that had cost Samuel his life and had threatened so many others. They were not safe yet and nowhere near done. They were escaping one battlefield, only to enter another. But this time they were not just running, they were fighting. They were a team. And they were prepared. Chapter 15. The Hidden Path. Amiens was a city teetering on the edge. The constant threat of German advance loomed, casting a palpable tension over its inhabitants. Isabel and Elise, settling into their cramped safe house, felt the pressure acutely. They needed to act swiftly, to deliver the evidence against Davies and uncover any remaining collaborators before the city fell. Elise, with her extensive network of contacts, began making inquiries. She discovered that Davies' betrayal had indeed shaken the Allied command, but there were whispers of suspicion, of doubts about the extent of his network. Some believed he had acted alone, while others feared a deeper conspiracy. Isabel, meanwhile, decided to revisit Samuel's diary, searching for any overlooked clues, any hints of other individuals who might have been involved. She pored over the entries, her fingers tracing the familiar handwriting, her mind racing. She noticed a recurring symbol, a small, stylized drawing of a raven that appeared in several entries, always alongside coded messages. She initially dismissed it as a reference to Le Corbeau, to Mueller, but now, with Davies' betrayal, she wondered if it might have a different meaning. She showed the symbol to Elise, who recognized it immediately. That's not Mueller's symbol, she said. That's the mark of a different network. A more secretive one. One that Samuel was investigating before he died. Isabel's heart skipped a beat. Another network? A deeper conspiracy? It was more complex than they had imagined. Elise explained that Samuel had suspected the existence of a group of high-ranking officials on both sides of the war who were secretly collaborating, manipulating events for their own personal gain. He had called them the Raven Circle. He believed they were prolonging the war, Elise said, her voice filled with a mixture of anger and sadness. That they were profiting from the suffering, from the endless bloodshed. Isabel was stunned. The scale of the betrayal was staggering. It was not just about individual traitors, but a network of powerful individuals who were actively working to undermine the war effort, to keep the conflict going for their own selfish purposes. They decided to focus their efforts on uncovering the members of the Raven Circle. They knew it was a dangerous undertaking, that they were up against powerful and ruthless enemies, but they were determined to bring them to justice. Elise, using her contacts, discovered that a meeting of the Raven Circle was scheduled to take place in Amiens within the next few days. The location was kept secret, but Elise was confident she could find it. Meanwhile, Isabel continued to study Samuel's diary, searching for any clues that might help them identify the members of the circle. She found a hidden compartment within the diary, similar to the one that had contained the key to the metal box. Inside the compartment, she found a small, rolled-up piece of paper. She carefully unrolled it, revealing a list of names, written in Samuel's elegant handwriting. The names were coded, but Isabel recognized some of them. They were high-ranking officials, military leaders, politicians, individuals who held positions of power and influence. She showed the list to Elise, who confirmed her suspicions.
"These are them," she said.
The members of the Raven Circle. They had the names. They had the evidence. Now they needed to find a meeting place, to expose them, to bring their conspiracy to light. The path ahead was hidden, dangerous, and uncertain, but they were ready to follow it, to fight for justice, to honor Samuel's memory, and to bring an end to the endless cycle of betrayal and bloodshed. The city around them seemed to hold its breath. Chapter 16. Across the No Man's Land. The discovery of the list of names in Samuel's diary was a turning point. Isabel and Elise now had concrete targets, individuals they could focus on, but the challenge of exposing them remained immense. The members of the Raven Circle were powerful, influential, and deeply entrenched within the structures of power. Elise, using her contacts within the resistance, learned that the meeting of the Raven Circle was to take place at a heavily guarded chateau on the outskirts of Amiens, a location that was dangerously close to the front lines. The chateau had been requisitioned by the Germans, but it was secretly being used by the Circle as a neutral meeting ground, a place where they could gather without arousing suspicion. The proximity to the front lines presented both a challenge and an opportunity. The area was heavily patrolled, making it difficult to approach, but the chaos and confusion of the war zone also provided a degree of cover, a chance to slip through the cracks. Isabel and Elise decided to take a daring, unconventional approach. They would cross No Man's Land, the desolate, shell-scarred strip of land that separated the Allied and German trenches. It was a suicidal mission, a journey into the heart of darkness, but it was their only chance to reach the chateau undetected. They secured forged documents, posing as nurses on a humanitarian mission, and obtained the necessary passes to enter the restricted zone near the front lines. They dressed in simple, nondescript clothing, blending in with the refugees and wounded soldiers who were constantly moving back and forth between the lines. As they approached No Man's Land, the sights and sounds of war intensified. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and cordite. The ground trembled with the constant shelling, and the sky was lit up by the flashes of artillery fire. They waited until nightfall, under the cover of darkness, to make their crossing. They crawled on their bellies, inching their way across the muddy, cratered landscape, avoiding the barbed wire, the landmines, and the watchful eyes of the sentries. The journey was terrifying, a constant dance with death. Shells exploded around them, sending shrapnel whizzing past their heads. They saw the bodies of dead soldiers, lying where they had fallen, their faces frozen in expressions of terror. Isabel felt a surge of adrenaline, a mixture of fear and determination. She thought of Samuel, of Elise, of all those who had suffered because of the war, of the conspiracy that was prolonging the conflict. She had to keep going. She had to reach the chateau. She had to expose the Raven Circle. After what seemed like an eternity, they reached the other side of No Man's Land, slipping past the German lines undetected. They were exhausted, covered in mud, and their nerves were frayed, but they had made it. They followed a hidden path through the woods, leading towards the chateau. The building loomed before them, a dark, imposing silhouette against the night sky. They knew that they were entering a lion's den, that they were surrounded by enemies, but they were prepared. They had come too far, risked too much, to turn back now. They had crossed the no-man's land between life and death, between justice and betrayal, and they were ready to face whatever awaited them inside the chateau. The final confrontation, they knew, was at hand. Chapter 17. The Heart of the Enemy. The chateau was a hive of activity, despite the late hour. Guards patrolled the grounds, their footsteps echoing in the night. Inside, lights blazed from the windows, casting long, flickering shadows on the surrounding landscape. Isabel and Elise, using their forged documents, managed to slip past the guards at the main entrance, posing as nurses delivering medical supplies. The interior of the chateau was a surreal mix of opulence and war. Lavishly decorated rooms, filled with antique furniture and priceless artwork, were now serving as meeting places for the members of the Raven Circle. The air was thick with cigar smoke and the murmur of hushed conversations. Isabel and Elise moved through the chateau, their senses on high alert, searching for any sign of the meeting. They knew they had to be careful, that one wrong move could expose them and lead to their capture. They discovered that the meeting was taking place in a large, secluded library on the second floor. The room was heavily guarded, making it impossible to enter directly. Isabel and Elise found a small, unused service staircase that led to a hidden balcony overlooking the library. From their vantage point, they could see and hear everything that was happening inside the room. They watched as the members of the Raven's Circle gathered around a large, mahogany table. They recognized some of the faces from Samuel's list, high-ranking military officers, politicians, industrialists, individuals from both sides of the war. The discussion was led by a man Isabel had never seen before, a tall, imposing figure with a commanding presence. He was the leader of the Raven Circle, the mastermind behind the conspiracy. "The war is progressing according to plan," he said, his voice cold and calculating. "The stalemate continues, the profits are flowing, and our power is growing." Isabel's blood ran cold. She listened in horror as the members of the circle discussed their plans, their manipulation of events, their callous disregard for human life. They were profiting from the war, deliberately prolonging the conflict for their own selfish gain. Elise, her face a mask of fury, gripped Isabel's arm. "We have to stop them," she whispered. "We have to expose them." Isabel nodded. They had the evidence, the list of names, the knowledge of their meeting. But they needed to get the information to the right people, to someone who could bring them to justice. They decided to use the chateau's communication system, a network of telephones and telegraph lines that connected the building to the outside world. They knew it was risky, that their actions could be traced, but it was their only chance to alert the Allied command. Isabel, using her knowledge of medical procedures, created a diversion, pretending to attend to a wounded guard near the communication room. Meanwhile, Elise slipped inside, using her skills to tap into the telegraph line. She sent a coded message to a trusted contact within the Allied command, revealing the location of the meeting, the names of the members of the Raven Circle, and the details of their conspiracy. As Elise was finishing the transmission, a guard entered the room, his eyes widening in surprise. He raised his weapon, shouting in alarm. Isabel and Elise knew they had been discovered. They had to escape, to get out of the chateau before it was too late. The heart of the enemy had been pierced, but the battle was far from over. They were running out of time once again. Chapter 18. Scars of the Past. The alarm spread through the chateau like wildfire. Guards rushed towards the communication room, their shouts and footsteps echoing through the corridors. Isabel and Elise, realizing they were trapped, barricaded the door, buying themselves a few precious moments. "We need to get out of here," Isabel said, her voice urgent.
"Now."
Elise nodded, her eyes scanning the room. There was a window overlooking a small courtyard. It was their only chance. They smashed the window, the sound of shattering glass echoing in the night. They climbed out onto a narrow ledge, the cold air hitting their faces. Below them, guards were swarming the courtyard, their weapons raised.
"Jump!"
Elise shouted, pushing Isabel towards the edge. Isabel hesitated for a moment, her fear momentarily paralyzing her. Then, she took a deep breath and jumped, landing hard on the ground below. Elise followed, landing beside her. They scrambled to their feet and ran, dodging the guards, their hearts pounding in their chests. They made their way through the chateau grounds, following a hidden path that Elise had discovered earlier. They could hear the shouts of the guards behind them, the sounds of pursuit growing closer. They reached the edge of the chateau grounds, where a dense forest provided cover. They plunged into the trees, the darkness enveloping them. They ran for what seemed like an eternity, their lungs burning, their legs aching. They could hear the guards searching for them, their voices echoing through the woods. Finally, they reached a small, secluded clearing, where they collapsed, exhausted and out of breath. They were safe for the moment, but they knew they were still in danger. As they rested, Isabel noticed a deep gash on Elise's arm, a wound she had sustained during their escape. "You're hurt," Isabel said, her voice filled with concern. Elise dismissed it with a wave of her hand. "It's nothing," she said. "Just a scratch." But Isabel knew it was more than just a scratch. She cleaned the wound and bandaged it, using strips of cloth torn from her dress. As she was tending to Elise's wound, Isabel noticed a scar on Elise's wrist, a small, circular scar that looked old and faded. "What's that?" Isabel asked, pointing to the scar. Elise hesitated for a moment, her expression turning somber. It's a reminder," she said, her voice low. "A reminder of the past." She revealed that the scar was a self-inflicted wound, a mark of her despair and desperation after Samuel's capture. She had been so consumed by grief and guilt that she had tried to end her own life. Isabel was stunned. She had known that Elise had suffered, that she had lost the man she loved, but she had never realized the depth of her pain, the extent of her despair. "Elise," Isabel said, her voice filled with compassion. I had no idea." Elise forced a smile. "It was a long time ago," she said. "I've moved on. I've found a new purpose. I'm fighting for Samuel, for justice, for a better future." Isabel embraced her, a silent acknowledgement of their shared pain, their shared resilience, their shared determination to fight for a world free from betrayal and bloodshed. The scars of the past, both visible and invisible, were a constant reminder of what they had lost, but they were also a source of strength, a fuel for their fight. They had come this far and, despite it all, felt closer than ever. Chapter 19. A Revelation in the Ruins. The escape from the chateau had been harrowing, but Isabel and Elise knew they couldn't rest. The message Elise had sent to the Allied command was a gamble. They had no way of knowing if it had been received, or if it would be acted upon. They had to assume that the members of the Raven Circle were still at large, still plotting, still prolonging the war for their own gain. They decided to return to Reims, to the place where their journey had begun. It was a risky move, as the city was now under constant threat of German attack, but they felt drawn back to the familiar surroundings, to the place where Samuel's ghost still lingered. They found refuge in the ruined convent where Isabel had worked as a nurse, the building now even more devastated than before. The field hospital had been evacuated, the wounded soldiers moved to safer locations, and the convent was now a desolate, empty shell. They settled into a small, relatively undamaged room, the same room where Isabel had first read Samuel's diary, where she had discovered the secrets that had set them on this dangerous path. As they were resting, Isabel remembered something. The rose window. The key. The hidden compartment in the cathedral. She had retrieved the metal box, but she had never fully explored its contents. She pulled out the box, which she had kept hidden throughout their journey. She opened it, revealing the items inside. Elise's diary, the letters, and the photograph of Elise. But there was something else, something she had overlooked before. At the bottom of the box, beneath a layer of faded velvet, was a small, folded piece of paper. Isabel carefully unfolded it, revealing a drawing. It was a detailed map of Reims, but with a specific location marked with a red circle. The location was a small, unassuming building near the cathedral, a building that Isabel recognized as a former bookstore. "What is it?" Elise asked, peering over Isabel's shoulder. Isabel pointed to the marked location. I think it's their headquarters," she said. "The Raven Circle." Samuel must have known about it. Elise studied the map, her eyes widening in realization. "You're right," she said. "That's it. That's where they've been operating from, all along." They decided to investigate the bookstore, to see if they could find any further evidence, any proof that would confirm their suspicions. They waited until nightfall, under the cover of darkness, to approach the building. The streets of Reims were deserted, the city holding its breath in anticipation of the next German offensive. The bookstore was dark and silent, its windows boarded up. Isabel and Elise found a back entrance, a small, unlocked door that led into a dusty storeroom. They moved through the building cautiously, their senses on high alert. They found a hidden staircase, leading down to a basement. The basement was a revelation. It was a fully equipped communication center, with telegraph lines, maps, coded messages, and documents detailing the activities of the Raven Circle. It was the heart of the conspiracy, the place where the members of the Circle had been coordinating their efforts, manipulating events, prolonging the war. As they were examining the evidence, they heard a noise. Footsteps, approaching fast. They quickly hid behind a large stack of crates, their hearts pounding in their chests. A group of men entered the basement, their faces illuminated by the flickering light of a lantern. They were members of the Raven Circle, and they were discussing their plans to escape, to disappear before the Allied forces arrived. Isabel and Elise listened in horror as the men talked about destroying the evidence, about covering their tracks, about ensuring that their conspiracy would never be exposed. Suddenly, one of the men noticed something amiss. He pointed to the crates where Isabel and Elise were hiding. "Someone's here," he said, his voice filled with suspicion. The men approached the crates, their weapons drawn. Isabel and Elise knew they were trapped. They had found the heart of the conspiracy, but they were about to be discovered, their mission on the brink of failure. The revelation, it seemed, might also be their end. Chapter 20. The Final Reckoning. The members of the Raven Circle closed in, their faces grim and determined. Isabel and Elise braced themselves for the inevitable confrontation, their hands reaching for the small weapons they carried. Suddenly, the lights went out, plunging the basement into darkness. Chaos erupted. Shouts, gunshots, the sounds of a struggle filled the air. Isabel and Elise, using the darkness to their advantage, slipped away from the crates, moving silently towards the staircase. They had no idea what was happening, who was fighting whom, but they knew they had to escape. As they reached the staircase, they saw a figure emerge from the darkness. It was Elise's contact from the Resistance, the one she had sent the message to from the chateau. He was accompanied by several armed men. "We got your message," he said, his voice low and urgent. "We're here to help." The Resistance fighters engaged the members of the Raven Circle, a fierce firefight breaking out in the confined space of the basement. Isabel and Elise, guided by the Resistance fighter, made their way out of the bookstore and into the deserted streets of Reims. They could hear the sounds of the battle raging behind them, the gunshots, the shouts, the screams. They knew that the fate of the Raven Circle was being decided, that the conspiracy was finally being brought to an end. As they reached a safe distance, they looked back at the bookstore, now engulfed in flames. The fire was spreading rapidly, consuming the building and everything inside. The evidence, the proof of the conspiracy, was being destroyed. But it didn't matter. The message had been sent, the Allied command had been alerted, and the members of the Raven Circle were being hunted down. Isabel and Elise knew that their journey was not over, that there would be more battles to fight, more challenges to overcome. But they had struck a major blow against the forces of darkness, against the individuals who had been prolonging the war for their own selfish gain. They had honored Samuel's memory, they had avenged his death, and they had brought hope to a world consumed by conflict. They had found love and trust, and a new way forward. As they walked away from the burning building, the first rays of dawn broke through the clouds, illuminating the war-torn city of Reims. A new day was dawning, a day filled with uncertainty, but also with the promise of a better future. A future free from betrayal, from conspiracy, from the endless cycle of violence and bloodshed. They had each other. They had their strength. They had their resilience. and they had their unwavering commitment to justice. That, they both knew, was all that mattered. The reckoning, while incomplete, had begun. Epilogue. The weeks that followed were a blur of activity. The Allied forces, spurred by the information Elise had transmitted, launched a major offensive, pushing back the German lines and liberating occupied territories. The members of the Raven Circle, their conspiracy exposed, were rounded up and brought to justice. Isabel and Elise, their mission accomplished, were hailed as heroes. They were offered medals, accolades, and positions of honor, but they declined, preferring to return to a quieter life, away from the spotlight and the constant reminders of the war. They settled in a small village in the French countryside, far from the battlefields and the cities that had been scarred by the conflict. They found solace in each other's company, in the peace and tranquility of their new surroundings. They never forgot Samuel, his sacrifice, his unwavering belief in justice. They often visited his grave, a simple marker in a small cemetery near Reims, a place where they could remember him and honor his memory. Isabel, finally free from the burdens of the past, found a renewed sense of purpose. She used her medical skills to help the local community, tending to the sick and the injured, offering comfort and support to those who had suffered during the war. Elise, her spirit healed, rediscovered her love of music. She began playing the piano again, her melodies filling their small cottage with a sense of joy and hope. They built a life together, a life based on love, trust, and a shared commitment to making the world a better place. They had found each other in the midst of chaos and despair, and they had emerged stronger, wiser, and more resilient. The war had left its scars, both visible and invisible, but it had also forged a bond between them, a bond that could never be broken. They had faced betrayal, loss, and unimaginable danger, but they had found love, friendship, and a new beginning. Years passed, and the world slowly began to heal. The wounds of war gradually faded, replaced by a sense of hope and a renewed belief in the future. Isabel and Elise, their hair now streaked with silver, often sat together on their porch, watching the sunset over the rolling hills of the French countryside. They had lived through a dark and terrible time, but they had emerged victorious, their spirits unbroken, their love enduring. They had found peace, finally, after the long and arduous journey. They had found each other, and they had found a future they had built together, a future filled with love, hope, and the enduring memory of the man who had brought them together, the ghost of Samuel Hayes. The footprints in the snow, though long faded, had left a permanent mark.